We will compare and contrast the emergence of states in South America with the emergence of states in Mesoamerica. This also occurred in a coastal region along the Gulf Coast in the modern Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco. This is known as the Olmec region. Compared to coastal South America, this is an area that was incredibly rich in wild resources and arable land. However, it lacks many other resources. It is on a flat coastal plain that is built up through the deposits of flood sediments over millennia, and it lacks stone. In these floodplain sediments, anything larger than a sand grain was likely moved by people, and stone that would be needed to manufacture flakestone tools, groundstone tools to be used in construction had to be imported from as far away as 60 or more miles. There were extensive trade networks that were developed in order to acquire exotic resources from both adjacent and distant areas. Resources like jade, magnetite, basalt, and obsidian. Jade and magnetite were used to manufacture ornaments in order to signal an individual's social role or status. Basalt was used for the construction of monuments, statues, and other objects. And obsidian was an important material for manufacturing flakestone tools. Craft goods manufactured in the Olmec region, particularly pottery, figurines, and masks that were usually manufactured from jade, were widely distributed throughout other areas of Mesoamerica. The pottery has been chemically sourced to the Olmec area. We have read about how the tempering materials in Hohokam pottery is used to identify the sources of their production. In the Olmec region, chemical means were used to identify the mineral composition of the clays and match those to clay deposits that they were manufactured from, identifying their production near Olmec sites. In addition to these objects, ideas were exported as well, an ideology of rulership and what constituted and created rulers, and cosmological associations that rulers have with the underworld and the deities that reside within them. These spread with these artistic styles and objects that encoded these ideals. There's been a lot of question in Mesoamerican archaeology as to whether Olmec is a mother culture, the foundation of complex societies and states in the region, or was it a sister culture? Rather than being founding and the first, being one of several cultures that interacted and together emerged into state-level organization. This debate between those who support the mother culture interpretation versus those who support the sister culture interpretation has at times gotten quite tense and vitriolic, sometimes devolving into name-calling. Not just that I think your ideas are incorrect and the evidence used to support it is insufficient, but rather you're also an idiot. Now, these are not very productive arguments when they start to devolve to name-calling, and hopefully future generations will become more collegial in trying to sort out this issue. The weight of the evidence, in my opinion, however, supports the mother culture interpretation, because the earliest, largest sites are found in the Olmec region, and the artistic styles that encode these ideas of rulership originate in the Olmec area and are distributed through trade to adjacent areas. But once one culture starts to develop complexity, it influences the neighboring cultures that it interacts with, leading to cultural development and increasing complexity in these adjacent areas. So as states emerged and grew in the Olmec area, adjacent areas that they were interacting and trading with began to adopt these same political and social innovations and become complex themselves. This map shows where the Olmec heartland is on the Gulf Coast within the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco. And there is also a sort of enclave, an Olmec enclave on the Pacific coast in the Mazatlan region. This was an area where cacao grows naturally. Cacao is the source of chocolate, and it was used in ritual activities from the Olmec times all the way into the late historic period by the Aztec. Cacao is only native to the Pacific slope and drainages that head into the Pacific Ocean. And Olmec people established outposts in this region in order to extract this resource. And eventually they would transplant chocolate and begin growing it in their own territories. The map also shows sites in adjacent areas that interacted with the Olmec, traded with them, and were influenced by them in order to develop complex social systems in other areas, like San Jose Mogote in Oaxaca, and other sites on the Central Plateau around modern-day Mexico City, like Chalcatzingo. Jade was one of the resources that was highly desired but completely absent in the Olmec area, having to be obtained from southern Guatemala or Honduras, several hundred miles distant. Jade was transformed into a variety of specialized objects that were used in ritual and political performances, and objects manufactured in these forms from jade were then exported out of the Olmec area, exchanged by elites in the Olmec region with elites in other regions who then adopted these new forms of political and ritual expression. These objects are called masks because they are representations of faces that could be placed upon another human face, but these are not masks in the sense that they would have been worn by living people. As you can see, they have no eye holes. You could not see through the mask if you wore it on your face. We believe these were primarily used to decorate bundles that contained mummies or the remains of ancestors, putting a face on the bundle that before it would be placed within a tomb. Jade was also used to produce celts or axes. These are polished, and these were not axes that you would use to chop firewood. These are symbols of power and authority. On the central one, you can see that it has inscribed designs upon it, a representation of a deity, and a hand with a doorway within it. Remember from the Woodland and Mississippian areas that the constellation Orion was represented as a hand, with a doorway, a portal that allowed entrance into the afterworld. And this seems to be a similar representation of a constellation, hand constellation, acting as a portal or a doorway to access great powers, access the underworld, supernatural powers that reside there, and the deities that reside there. At the end of this lecture, we will see another carving that has representations of deities that seems to be foundational to the pantheon of gods that would continue to be recognized over the next 3,000 years in Mesoamerica. Magnetite is a type of iron ore that could be polished to create a smooth, reflective surface, to create mirrors. Not mirrors that you would admire your own face in, but mirrors that provided a reflective surface to stare at and contemplate and assist the focusing of mental energies in order to enter into a trance state. These mirrors were often worn about the neck, and in the image on the left, you can see two holes drilled within it to allow for suspension. And the image on the right is a figurine that is shown wearing a mirror at the neck. You would have these suspended from the neck, so when the shamanic specialist is staring at it, using it to concentrate their mental energies to help them transition into a trance state. When they enter into that trance state and lose their physical capabilities, they don't drop their mirror, allowing it to hit the ground and shatter. but rather it stays suspended about their neck. Note also the cross-legged posture of the individual. Various body postures can be used in order to control the flow of blood into the brain and assist transition into a trance state. The flow of blood through the legs is somehow intimately associated with the flow of blood to the brain. And if any of you served in the military, you know that you do not stand at attention with your knees, both knees locked for greater than 10 minutes, because the effect of the flow of blood to your brain when locking your knees can lead to you passing out, fainting. And there are various ways that the body posture can be adjusted to assist entering into a trance state. This was known to prehistoric shamans here in the New World, and is also known to ritual specialists in other parts of the world. Yogis and other practitioners of South Asian religions use various body postures to assist them to enter into a contemplative meditative state, which is, in all essence, a trance state. Pottery that was manufactured in the Olmec area was exchanged widely throughout the rest of Mesoamerica, and we know this because of the clays. There were two different types of pots that were manufactured, these white-slipped and painted pots, and the polished blackwares that have incised designs upon them. Some standardized design features were incorporated into these in order to express certain ideas and values. Commonly found on these pots is what we call the earth dragon motif. You can see in the top what appears to be a dragon with a snout to the right, an eye with horns or flames rising from above it, a mouth, and then towards the rear on the left, wings or a tail. It is somewhat clear in the topmost representation, but becomes increasingly abstract in the lower representations. In Mesoamerica, the world was seen to be a giant caiman that was floating in a primordial sea. The earth itself is a giant dragon, and this is a representation of this creature. The Olmec region is a very lush and productive environment. Here we can see at the site of Laguna de los Cerros that much of the site is now under cultivation of corn. As we see on the right hand and in the lower left, fields of corn being cultivated around this ceremonial center, where you see a series of mounds, long linear platforms that define a plaza that is in front of a pyramid. You may be looking at that pyramid in the upper left and note the sort of depression in its summit. You might be thinking to yourself, that looks an awful lot like a volcano. And we believe that these pyramids may have been built as effigies of volcanoes. This is one of those pyramids at the site of Levanta. And not only is there a giant pyramid, but the pyramid is built on a giant flat earthen platform that raises the whole ceremonial center above the surrounding flat rainforest. This pyramid was excavated in the 1930s and was found to have very interesting external features that seem to indicate it was designed to look like a volcano. Here's another view just to give you an idea of the size and scale in relation to the standing trees and the person at its base. In this artist's reconstruction of the site, the pyramid is labeled as an effigy volcano, and you can see how there seem to be separate lobes of earth coming down. It wasn't a smooth, flat-sided feature, and each of these lobes was manufactured and finished with a different color clay, red, orange, black, yellow, and they almost look like lava flowing down from the summit of a volcano. And how would these people know about volcanoes? On the southeastern edge of the Olmec territory rise the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range where there have been volcanic eruptions during the historic period that the Olmec occupied the region. So they would have been aware of and familiar with the effects of volcanic eruptions, with the expression of the power of the earth that is seen in a volcano. And by building these effigies of volcanoes, perhaps trying to communicate with and tap into those powers of the earth. Along the platforms that flank the open plaza that fronts onto the volcano were structures that were administrative centers and the residences of the ruling elite. And within the plazas were these features that are labeled as mosaic pavements. And these were literally pavements made from greenstone, a sort of low-grade jade. And some of them would have been exposed at the surface during the use of the plaza and associated features, but others were buried, perhaps as dedicational offerings to the plaza above that would be used. Here is an overview of one of these mosaic pavements. Each of those blocks is a piece of greenstone, which is sort of a low-grade jade. It's jade that had not been It would have become jade if it had stayed underground for longer, exposed to greater amounts of heat and pressure through metamorphosis. But it is still a valued material that was incredibly rare and had to be obtained from great distances, as far away as southern Guatemala and Honduras. The designs created in these mosaics have been interpreted in two ways. When viewed from the perspective we see here, it has been suggested to be the face of an animal. You can see the mouth across the bottom, the eyes at the top with the nose in between. And one feature that's interesting to note about the mouth is the split in the middle upwards from the lip. These have been interpreted as representing the faces of jaguars, who have that shape of a mouth with upturning corners and a split in the middle going up towards the nose. A prominent nose and eyes above that. The jaguar is the apex predator in the jungles around this region and would have been the only animal that challenged the dominance of humans and was a natural symbol of power and was associated with political power and authority. Viewed from a different perspective, looking across it from the other direction, these can be seen as representing a different animal. And in this image, which was taken after a rain, you can see the bright green color of these stones. It has been suggested when viewed from this perspective that these are representations of serpents, in particular a type of rattlesnake that lives in that region, a green rattlesnake, a highly venomous and dangerous rattlesnake, a rattlesnake that has a neurotoxin that leads to very rapid death if someone is bitten by one. So the chained objects at the bottom are seen as the diamond shape that is on the rattlesnake's back. You have the bar that is above the eyes and the pits that are between the nostrils and the eyes. Rattlesnakes are pit vipers. They have a heat-sensing organ that is in a pit that is between their eyes and their nose. And it's suggested that these may be representations of serpents if viewed from this direction, while they could be viewed as jaguars when rotated around in the other direction. Serpents, like jaguars, are very powerful animals that can be associated with certain meanings and come to symbolize those. Serpents shed their skin and are reborn. Serpents also have the ability to enter into cracks in the earth and go down into the underworld. This image from La Venta, dating to about 1600 BC, is believed to be the earliest representation of a feathered serpent in Mesoamerican art. Feathered serpents continue to be important features in Mesoamerican art through the later Mayan and into the later Aztec period, associated with particular deities, in particular deities that are associated with the winds and the ability to transform and enter into the underworld. Here we see a serpent, its head above, its body curling around below the human, to its tail bearing a rattle. It has a crest of feathers rising from its head, and it is bearing a human on its body, carrying them, helping them enter into the alternate dimension of the underworld. You can see that the human is wearing a helmet headdress that is identical in form to the head of the serpent that he rises. He has a banner that rises above him that identifies him and his social importance, and in his right hand he carries a sacred bag, a feature that we will see also in later Mesoamerican art. It identifies people of power, ritual specialists, who contain within these bags the ritual objects and substances that are needed in order for them to perform their rites and enter into other dimensions. In the episode of Digging for the Truth, we see experimental archaeology is done in order to understand the labor requirements to produce and transport these massive sculptures. These massive sculptures of human heads that are believed to be representations of the rulers of Olmec cities. Now there is no rock in the region where these cities are built, so these materials had to be transported from the Tuxtla Mountains some 60 miles distant, and these are huge, heavy blocks of basalt that are transported from the Tuxtlas and then transformed into these large sculptures. These sculptures range in size from 1.5 to 3.4 meters high and can weigh from 20 to 55 tons. They've been transported from the Tuxtlas some 60 miles away, and based upon experiments like the one that you will see in the video, it's estimated that it would take 1,500 people 3 to 4 months to quarry, move, and then carve these sculptures. We believe that they were portraits of rulers, and they had long and varied use lives. They were placed on public display, lining the sides of these plazas. They were sometimes recarved, transformed, in some cases from the head into an altar or a throne. Some were purposefully buried, as though at the end of the reign of the king, that the image had to be buried just like the body. However, there are some that appear to have been deliberately mutilated, that they were defaced, perhaps as an expression of opposition to the power and authority of the kings, perhaps as a king was overthrown, perhaps by internal dissent or by an external power. Basalt was also transported from the Tuxtla to make other forms of monumental construction, carved stone sarcophagi, and tombs that were created by large columns of basalt. On the left you can see this stone sarcophagus, literally a large stone coffin, and near the foot of the coffin you can see some of the columns that formerly covered it, as we see in the tomb on the right. Stone was also used to create sophisticated drainage systems in the centers of these Olmec cities. In some places, water was drained from springs and allowed to re-emerge in other areas in pools that were likely used for ritual bathing. You have pieces of stone that were carved into troughs, covered with slabs, and then fitted together, jointed like pipes, the joints between sealed with clay to allow the flow of water. Building and manufacturing these would have been incredibly labor-intensive, from quarrying the stone materials, transporting it 60 plus miles, transforming the raw stone into these highly shaped forms that had to be very standardized, made to the same dimensions to allow them to fit together into these drainage systems. While the Olmec are perhaps best known for the giant head sculptures, much more common and more widespread in their distribution are much smaller carvings, like these two, which we believe are representations of rulers. And what would give us this impression that they are rulers? They are seated upon thrones. You can see very clearly on the left a bench-like seat that the individual is elevated upon. And on the right, he is also seated upon some sort of feature and holding in his hands what appear to be torches. And not only do we have small carvings of individuals appearing to sit on thrones, we have actual thrones themselves. We have physical features that were used to elevate an individual over the others that were assembled before him. Now, these may not be as fancy as some European thrones or the Iron Throne from Game of Thrones. These are still important symbols of power and authority. There are other features that were initially interpreted as being altars, but are currently being reassessed as possibly being some type of throne as well. These are found outside and along the edges of the plazas in the same way that the giant heads were arranged. And they create a flat surface, initially thought to have been used for offerings, but now believed to have been used to elevate the ruler when he was participating or observing public rituals in the plazas. In the video, there is the suggestion that some of the giant head sculptures may have gone through a transformation during their life of use, from being a sculpture that represented the king's head to then being transformed into one of these altars or thrones. This carving shows a person emerging from a cave-like feature, and this cave-like feature is represented as being the mouth of a reptilian being. You can see the nostrils and the teeth above the individual's head, that this is like the mouth of a giant earth dragon. Caves are points of entry into the earth, into the body of the earth dragon, a place that contains the powers of creation in the underworld where the gods reside. And this shows an individual emerging forth out of a cave, wearing the headdress of a ruler. And it may be a representation of the ruler who sat upon that throne, showing that he had these powers to go down into and then emerge forth from the underworld, to communicate with the ancestors and the gods, and to bring the powers of creation from the underworld into this, the earth's surface that we live upon. While the previous throne showed an adult king emerging forth from the underworld, this one shows a baby being carried by a supernatural being and emerging from the underworld. And this may have been an artistic representation of the concept that kings and rulers were different and distinct from other people because of the nature of their origins, that they weren't born in the ordinary way, that they emerged from the underworld, bringing the powers with them, having these powers embodied in them at birth. And this isn't something that anyone can do, but it is something that is exclusive to particular people, to the ruling class. Various small statues that we believe represent rulers or shamans who are associated with the rulers seem to show a process of transformation, an ability to change from a human form into other forms, the ability to move from this world to other worlds, which provides the ability to communicate with the ancestors and the gods, to gain access to supernatural powers, and to bring them back to this world and apply them to the benefits of the people. Like the small statues that we saw in the Mississippian area that seem to tell a story when seen in sequence, some of these statues can also be seen as enacting this process of transition if you watch them view them in sequence. So I'm going to go through a series of small statues. This first one shows a very human-looking person, but notice the unusual posture that he has. His legs cross beneath him, perhaps in a way to control the flow of blood and assist the transition into a trance state. His arms seem as though he's swinging them back and forth, perhaps in rhythm with a song or a dance. He may be chanting, controlling his breath. And there's also likely external auditory stimuli from drums and rattles that accompany this chant, all of which would assist in the transition and entering into a trance state. Again, a relatively normal, ordinary human form, but note the unusual body position, with the head starting to elongate and be distinct and different. Here the facial features are beginning to transform and change. There seems to be fire erupting forth from the person's head and forehead as they change from a human form into a non-human form. Again, transformation of the facial features, transformation from human-like into a more animal-like. Look how the ears are starting to look pointed, and again the flame-like features that are springing forth above the eyes and on top of the head. And here an individual is completing that transformation, changing from a human into a jaguar form, into what is called by some analysts the were jaguar, like a werewolf, an animal that is a human that is transformed into that animal from the human form and has the ability to transform back. And finally, a representation of the complete transformation. This looks like a jaguar and decidedly non-human, except for one feature. It is standing upright on its rear legs, something that jaguars can't do, but is characteristic of humans. So this is a human in jaguar form. Not an ordinary jaguar, not a natural jaguar, but an extraordinary, supernatural jaguar. A human that is transformed into a jaguar that allows them to enter into other dimensions, to contact the ancestors, to interact with the deities, and to bring powers back. The were jaguar is represented in a variety of ways, not just as small statues, but here as a mask, an actual mask that could be worn, with eye holes that could be seen through, but a mask that represents this transformation. Also, axes in the form of jaguars, suggesting that this is associated with power, the expression of political power and authority, as axes were symbols of political power and authority. And here that symbol is merged with the symbol of the were jaguar, the ability of the ruler to transform, to enter into other dimensions, where they interact with the gods and the ancestors. And this power is inherent from birth. Here we have a baby were jaguar. That this is something that individuals are born with. This isn't a skill that you learn. Rather, it is a power that is inherent in these individuals from their birth because of who they are and who they are descended from. This association with birth and descent provides a powerful sacred charter for those individuals who claimed this power, that they were preordained from before time to have been born this way, to provide a conduit between the afterworld, the underworld, the deities, the ancestors, and the living world of the people, that they provide a point of communication, and this justifies their power. And as a final look at this expression of power of the rulers being associated with their birth as a special type of human being, different from ordinary people, possessing extraordinary and supernatural abilities, we see this statue that's called the Las Limas figurine. It shows a deity bearing forth a child. The child has the features of a were jaguar, And on their chest, they have a symbol that is used repeatedly in Mesoamerican art to represent a portal to enter the underworld, this cross within a square. And then on the shoulders and knees of the figure that holds the child are the faces of various deities, the pantheon of deities that will be recognized for the next 3,000 years in Mesoamerica, a deity associated with wind, water, fire, and death. This suggests that at the center of this pantheon are these particular people, the rulers who possess these powers to move between worlds, to move from the world of the living to the underworld, the world of the gods and the ancestors, to interact with the powers therein and return with those powers in order to benefit the community that they rule. So in contrast to coastal Peru, arable land was widely available, and it didn't lead to competition and conflict over control of the limited resource. Other resources were limited, particularly any type of stone. And so a pathway to power, rather the control and management of irrigation systems and the control and management of conflict, we have the control of trade of non-local materials. And we have the crafting of power. These exotic materials that are imported are transformed into symbols of powers that express these ideas of rulership and the association of the rulers to the supernatural. These objects were then redistributed out through the same trade networks that were used to obtain these materials. Thus, this ideology of rulership, born of the earth with transformative capabilities, is spread back out through the same network that exchange was used to obtain these materials. And so we see the emergence of these ideas of power and the creation of rulership by controlling trade and crafting power by creating these objects, originates in the Olmec area and then spreads back out through the same networks of trade and influences these other cultures in adjacent regions.